Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's Casual Friday, I have tidbits. I have 2 finished objects. And I'm returning to a work in progress that was on hold briefly, my vintage 1960s sweater. So let's get started. Years ago, I lived in New Zealand for a year. And one of the things about New Zealand was that people were outnumbered by sheep by a considerable amount. And if you were driving through the roads, they're very windy, hilly roads, you had to be careful as you came around a bend because you never knew what was going to be in the road. Often there was a huge number of sheep as they were being moved from one field to another. So you had to be careful as you were driving through New Zealand, but I had never seen or heard of that anywhere else. But Dramer, who is in my Ravelry group, shared a YouTube video that was filmed recently in Ohio, showing a somewhat similar situation on Highway 55. Apparently it happens every year and people show up to see it. So if you'd like to see a huge number of sheep being moved from one place to another and using the highway to travel on, it's pretty cool. It's also really fun to watch how the people and the sheepdogs interact with each other and with the sheep to keep the sheep from running off on their own somewhere. This tidbit also came to me in my Ravelry group, this time from Vaughn, I believe is how the name is pronounced. And it is also a YouTube video. It is an animated history of hand spinning, and all of the animation is done using wool. So wool that has been felted into different animal or people shapes or object shapes, but it just kind of shows you the progression of how humans first began spinning fibers together and then how it evolved through the millennia. Every so often across my social media feed, I will see a piece of art that depicts a woman doing some kind of textile craft. A lot of times it's knitting, but sometimes it could be other things. And this week across my social media feed came an interview that was done on the Today Show by Al Roker. And he was interviewing these 2 women who are knitters. They are Black women who are knitters, and I think they found each other through social media. But they were talking about the importance of community in knitting. But they were also talking about a really famous photograph of Sojourner Truth, and I will put that photograph up here. And I've always loved this photograph because, in particular, Sojourner Truth was one of my childhood heroes, but also because she was holding her knitting. So I always have loved that photograph. And what struck one of these women, her name is Darci Kern, was that she wanted to see more Black women that were depicted in art with their knitting. Like that was something she could really connect to. And so she searched for all of these art objects with the keyword knitting, and she could only find a couple of them that showed Black women in them. And so she has this project. It was a 12-week project, but she has continued it on her Instagram feed, so you can go look at it on there. She has taken pieces of art that show women doing something related to knitting. It could be spinning or it could be knitting. And then recreating, putting herself in that picture. She'll get clothing that she has or things from her stash that she already has in her home and try to recreate the look and the pose of that piece of art, but putting herself in it. And one of the things that she does on her Instagram page is she talks about the time period when that original piece of artwork was done and who it was done by. And then she talks about what was going on in history at that time. In particular, what was happening in the lives of Black people at that time, the significant events. And I think it's a really interesting project because first of all, I love those kinds of projects where people recreate famous images in their modern life in some way. But I also think it's a really great way to kind of show parallel histories, things that were going on at the same time, and what was chosen to be depicted in art versus what was chosen to be excluded from art. So if you're interested in that, I'll leave a link down below to the Today Show interview, but also to Darci's Instagram and to a blog post that talks about the original 12 photograph series that she did that was part of a grant that she got. This tidbit came to me on my social media feed from Fleece to Fashion. So a lot of times the things that I feature here on Tidbits come from the Fleece to Fashion social media feed. So that is a social media feed from the Fleece to Fashion project at the University of Glasgow. So they're often showing different pieces of art. They're giving programs. Some of the programs that I have attended via Zoom this year have been through Fleece to Fashion. They have just launched or relaunched their website. It has like an all new look and organization. And it tells more about what their Fleece to Fashion project actually is. So I'll just read a segment from the website, but I'll leave a link to it as well. It says, today the production of knitted textiles makes a vital contribution to the Scottish economy, ranging from wool production to designer fashion. It incorporates sheep husbandry, spinning and dyeing, design and production of cloth and clothing, textile tourism, and retail. This project follows the production cycle from fleece to fashion, interrogating why and how knitting has adapted to and survived modernization to become a distinctive heritage brand in the modern Scottish economy and culture. Again, I follow them on social media, so I find a lot of really interesting things coming from them on a daily basis. This next tidbit actually came from the Knitters Guild. This past weekend, they had an event at our textile center where all the guilds have their libraries and they have space where they can have classes and things like that. Of course, we haven't been able to meet in person for the past year. But the Guild does service projects every year. We have 3 service projects where we're knitting hats for the homeless as well as for some other organizations. And so this was going to be a day where we could drop off service knitting at the Textile Center, but we could also drop off yarn that we wanted to donate. It had to be full skeins and it couldn't be 100% synthetic. It had to either be natural fiber or a blend. So since I've reorganized my office over the past few months, I've taken a lot of the yarn out of my stash that I didn't want anymore. And so I had 2 bags of yarn to drop off. So I was there, I had 1 hat to drop off for service knitting, but 2 big bags of yarn. And as I was dropping it off, Kathy, who is the president of our guild, came out to chat for a second. She goes, oh, we got this really cool donation. Do you have a second? Come take a look at this. So I went inside, and they were sorting out all of the yarn that had been donated to them. And there was a banker's box, and I could tell it was an old one. And she started lifting the lid off of it. And at first, I was thinking what I was looking at was one of those vintage knitting kits like I bought a couple of months ago. But then I realized, no, it was just a banker's box. She lifted the lid off of it, and she pulled this out. And it was a color card. And I was like, oh, I was so excited. And what was in the banker's box was Shetland wool. It was full with Shetland wool. And so there was this color card, and there were a couple of these order forms, and then there was like a sales receipt. And she said, I think that maybe she was a yarn shop owner because of this wholesale information, and we're not quite sure. And I didn't take the sales slip, but they did let me take these, because normally at the end of the year we have a silent auction, and all of the yarn that gets donated will get auctioned off. But they weren't going to auction off this, and so they said I could have it. So I'm going to do an overhead so that you can see what it is. So this is the color card, and what is interesting about this, it took me a while to figure out what was happening. It says at 99 cents per 50 gram ball, you save 40 to 60% over normal retail prices. And it's in this big red letters, Shetland wool, and then in smaller black letters, 80% wool, 20% polyester. And why such a giant saving? Lighters bought this fine Shetland as a manufacturer's surplus at a fraction of its regular cost. We pass the savings on to you. And so they have, you know, all of this information on here. But it doesn't say anything about the brand other than Lighters bought this. So if you look at this right here, this is a customer information booklet about Lighters designer fabrics, and they have a lot of information about their fabrics in here and information about their location, which is in Kansas City, Missouri. So I looked them up. This yarn did not come from a yarn shop. What it came from was one of those kind of home party things, like a Tupperware party. So these days, well, it was probably 10, 15 years ago, there was these home parties for everything, like handbags, candles, vitamin supplements, professional women's clothing. And so that was what this was. This is from the 1980s. And it was like a home party for yarn shopping. And that's probably the only type of home party shopping experience I would be willing to go to if it even existed anymore. I just found this really interesting. I don't know if they sold other types of yarn as well. These home parties were mostly about fabrics and they just, in addition, had the wool. I did figure out that the woman whose name was on the sales receipt that was included in this box of yarn actually worked at a department store here in town called Dayton's. It was the big fancy department store. Last week, I was telling you about a new vintage book that I'd gotten called Number Knitting. And this was a book published in 1955. I believe there was only one printing of it. And it turns out it was very influential to Elizabeth Zimmerman. And the reason is because the whole concept of this is designing around garter stitch and the properties of garter stitch. So in garter stitch, if you're knitting flat, you knit every row, and it takes 2 rows to create a ridge of garter stitch. If you measure how wide the stitches are, like if you measured 10 stitches, and then you measured 10 ridges of garter stitch, they are equivalent or very, very close to being equivalent. So that makes it really easy to create geometric shapes and modular knitted items using garter stitch. And that is what this book is about, all the different ways that you can create these geometric shapes. Someone in my Ravelry group mentioned that there was an Etsy shop called KnitSwag that actually had a digitized copy of it. And they were selling digitized copies of it. And it was much cheaper than trying to find an actual hard copy of it. And the issue that you can have with things from the mid-century, even if they're out of print, is that the copyright may or may not still be valid. You don't know. You can be sure that something before the early 1920s is in the public domain, but anything between the 1920s and say 1973-ish, I think is the date when the new law came out here in the United States. In that time period, you had to register your copyright and then you had to renew it. And so if the person who owned the copyright didn't renew it, then it would go into the public domain. So the only way you can know if something that's out of print is in the public domain is if you contact the Copyright Office and find out if the copyright was ever renewed. And it turns out that for number knitting, it was not. So it's in the public domain. So Kelly, who is the owner of the Etsy shop KnitSwag, also has a Ravelry group called Number Knitting. So she has been passionate about this book for years, not knowing that Elizabeth Zimmerman had tried to get it republished. She is working on creating crisper, clearer graphs, even colorizing things, but giving viewers the option to be able to see the original versus a colorized version of it by layering these graphs. She wants to have all of the projects reknit and photographed and test knit. And so it's a big project. And so she's looking for test knitters. So if this is something that sounds intriguing to you, and she'll share, what it is she'd want you to test knit. If that's something that's of interest to you, resurrecting this book that was so influential on Elizabeth Zimmerman, you might be interested in that. So I'll leave links to to Kelly's Etsy shop as well as to her Ravelry group, and you can decide if that might be something that you would be interested in. I finished the sock, my brother's socks. I haven't woven in the ends yet, but I'll do that. I have to wash them, and then I can mail them off. Somebody was asking me what the colorway was for this. I was explaining last week that when I knit what I call a plain vanilla sock like this, where I just choose whatever heel I want, whatever toe I want, and the rest of it's just stockinette. I'm using the self-striping yarn to entertain me. I don't use a pattern. I use measurements and then figure out, you know, how to construct the sock based on measurements and gauge. I was explaining that there is a tutorial that I did a couple of years ago called the August Sock Knit Along that goes through that whole process so that you can figure out how to modify sock heels if they don't normally give you a good fit, what you can do for that particular sock heel and your measurements, and you can learn how to modify things to fit you. So somebody was asking me about this yarn. This is Regia 6-ply. I think it's just the Regia color, and I'll link down to the information about this particular colorway down below. I really love Regia yarn. When I knit socks for myself, I will use the Regia 4-ply, which is a fingering weight. The 6-ply is more like a sport to almost DK weight yarn. It's a little bit thicker. My brother has size 13 feet, and you know, he's a big guy. He's 6'3", so he's big everywhere, and that means his socks have to be huge. But if I use the 6-ply yarn, I can basically knit as many stitches as I'd be knitting for myself with a 4-ply, and so it doesn't take forever to knit socks. So I like knitting socks for him because he is hard to fit, and commercial socks don't fit him really well. So he really appreciates hand knit socks. If you're interested in either that tutorial so you can learn how to customize socks, or in what this particular colorway is, I will leave that information down below. So my next finished project I want to show you is actually a sewing project. It's a little zipper bag that I made. It's like a little, like for toiletries, like if you're packing like on a trip or something, like remember when we used to do that? And it's got a lining on the inside. I haven't trimmed off the little tails of the serger thing yet. I just finished this morning. So I'm pretty proud of myself. It's not perfect, which is fine with me, but it's finished and it's functional, which I'm very happy about, because the first time I attempted to make this, it was a disaster. That was a learning process, you know, figuring out why things went so wrong. And there's a little piece of equipment in the serger called a stitch finger that normally it needs to be there, and you take it out if you want the edges of your fabric to roll. So if you want to make a rolled hem or something like that. So apparently 12 years ago, when the last time I used my serger, I had used it to make a rolled hem and I had taken the stitch finger out. So I didn't know that, and none of the basic, you know, videos on how to use your serger mention make sure your stitch finger is in there. They're assuming that it is, like it should be in there unless you deliberately need to take it out to do a rolled hem. So it explained all of the like touchy tension issues I had been having with my serger as I was reacquainting myself. So I've learned a lot, and it's actually really fun. And it's just really interesting to me to kind of look at knitting versus sewing, especially with the serger, where I sort of have this very small amount of knowledge in this one area, but I have a lot of knowledge in knitting, and how in textile crafts, there's a certain amount of overlap that's not directly applicable, but gives you a foundation that's very helpful. So my serger has 4 threads in it, and each one of them has a tension knob. So in knitting, I know what tension means. I know that it means, you know, the amount of tension that you're keeping on the working yarn as you're creating your stitches. And it also refers, in the UK, they call making a swatch, a tension swatch. We call it a gauge swatch here. Those things are all related. There can be a lot of reasons why you're not getting the correct gauge, that there's something in your personal tension and the way you're handling the yarn. You could be using the wrong yarn size. You could be using the wrong needle size. You could be doing something extra in your movements that's causing the tension to change. So there are a lot of things that can cause tension problems in knitting. And it's a sort of a broad and it's a deep topic. And the longer you knit and the more mistakes you make, the more you learn about how tension works and how to correct those problems. And so when I'm looking at the serger and the tension, I understand, what tension means, but how the tension of these 4 different threads work together in order with the fabric, and if the fabric is a different thickness or a thinness, what it is that you're trying to do, how you want to exert tension on those threads in order to produce a different effect. It's very different, and yet in some ways it's easier to understand for me now than maybe it was 12 years ago. Because of what I know in knitting. And I just think it's so nice to have some of this transferable knowledge. It's not direct, but it's just sort of having this base of knowledge about how textiles work in general across all, because every textile craft has tension. Crochet has it, weaving has it, spinning has it. So these crafts are all the same in that they all rely on tension, but they all rely on it in different ways, and there's different ways to manipulate tension and to use tension, and in order to get a specific result. And that is what I'm finding interesting, is trying to pull in what I know, what knitting has taught me, and how I can possibly apply that to another situation, and to see if it's going to help me. So if you have a serger or trying to learn how to use the serger, I will leave a link to the Craftsy class that I used in order to learn how to make this. This was it was fun though. It's fun to actually finish something. And when I look at the tiny little, inconsistencies in here, it's like it doesn't matter, because this one actually is finished and it's done, where the other one is a complete disaster. So I feel really good about this. I think I feel much better about this than if I had achieved this on my first try. I really do. I really think that I'm a lot more proud of myself than I would have been otherwise. I am back to work on my 1960s vintage sweater project. So in case you are new to the channel and you're not aware, I have a long-term project that I'm working on where I'm knitting my way through the 20th century, decade by decade, one sweater at a time. And so my goal is to see how construction methods changed in sweater knitting throughout the 20th century. So fashion was one influence on that, but how sweaters were used is another. And so I'm really interested in the techniques that were used, the construction methods that were used, and just how that process changed, and then how the patterns were presented, like how instructions were presented and how that evolved, and seeing like where the key points are that caused things to shift from being athletic wear in the early part of the 20th century to being fashionable wear, to going from being presented in one size and expecting the knitter to modify it to fit them, to how it went into multiple size pattern instructions and that sort of thing. And then to see how garments were shaped, what techniques were used, how that was instructed, etc. So one of the things I love about knitting is that there's always an opportunity to learn. And so a large part of this is picking things that I think would be interesting to knit and that would teach me something. Like, does this have an unusual construction method, or does it use a technique in a way I've never seen before? And is that something that could be used in a contemporary pattern, but we just don't see, like it's been lost because people come up with other things in later decades. So this project is a 1960s stockinette sweater, which I'll put the picture right there. And what really attracted me to that was this yoke, how that was constructed. That was something that was unusual that I'd never seen before, and I wanted to know how it worked. And on top of it, I've got the pattern. It was included in a vintage knitting kit from the 1960s that had yarn, and it came with the buttons and the girl grain ribbon, and it also came with coordinating fabric to go with the yarn. So this was a really common thing from about the 1930s to the 1970s, that you could get yarn with coordinating fabric. But I don't think that they became kits until the 1960s, possibly the 50s. At first, it was just you went to the fabric store, they sold fabric and they sold yarn, and they would have things that coordinated. And then in the 60s, these kits were really popular, and also into the 1970s. So I bought 3 different kits, and the kit that I bought that I think was from the early 1970s is the yarn that I am using for the sweater. So the yarn itself is from the 70s, but the pattern is from the 60s. And the back is really just stockinette. Now did I finish it? No, I haven't finished the back yet. The sweater went into a timeout because I had blocked it at some point just to make sure that my gauge was what I thought it was, and so that I knew that it would be time to start the underarm bind-offs, etc. And as I progressed, I kept measuring the total width of the sweater, and it seemed to be a couple of inches wider than I had expected. And I was concerned about it being too big and that I'd have to rip it out and reknit it. So it was thinking about having to rip out this much stockinette fabric and then reknit it was not interesting to me a couple of weeks ago. And I decided that what I would do is I was going to block it again, because I think when I blocked it, I took it wet and I kind of threw it on a surface and I just smoothed it out, but I didn't really check to see that I had laid it to the measurements it was supposed to be in. So I think what I was hoping that what I'd done was I just stretched it too much when I was letting it dry, and it stayed in that kind of wider state. So I soaked it again, and then I was much more careful about laying it out on a grid and pinning it to the actual dimensions, then letting it dry, taking the pins out and just letting it sit for a day or two and seeing what it did, if it stayed in the boundaries of what it was supposed to be, or if it was actually looser than I wanted it. It turned out is perfect, so it's not too big, so I don't have to reknit it. Still was worried about the yarn quantity. So the kit that I have, this one from the 1970s, had 8 of these balls of yarn, and the label said 50 grams. And so I was keeping track of my usage by weighing the ball of yarn. I'd weigh the ball of yarn, I would knit for a while, I'd weigh it again, and then I'd see, well, how many stitches did I knit and how many grams was that? It seemed like, oh, I'm going to have plenty of yarn because I've got 8 50-gram balls. But the problem was I realized none of these balls weighed 50 grams. You know, yarn can absorb and release moisture over time, and this has been about 50 years. So none of these balls weighed more than 45 grams. I think they were all about 43-ish. What I realized was I'm looking at how many stitches per gram I'm getting, but I don't have 400 grams of yarn. So that was when I started getting very concerned about, do I have enough yarn to do this? And you know, the option I have is to make the sleeves 3/4 length instead of full sleeves. So rather than finish this sweater, finish the back, I started with a new ball of yarn and I started working the front, and I wanted to get really accurate stitch per gram measurements for the ribbing at the bottom, which is done on a smaller needle. And then when I switch to the larger needle, get accurate stitches per gram with the stockinette in the larger needle. So what I want to do is kind of do an overhead and kind of show you where I am right now and show you how these pattern pieces are constructed, because it is an unusual construction and it's one I had to draw out to understand and really read through the instructions to understand what's going on. So one of the reasons that I like to block things mid-project, particularly the back of a sweater, is I just want to make sure that my gauge is correct, that my row gauge is correct. Usually I'm pretty confident of my stitch gauge. And in this case, when I blocked it, I let it kind of drag on whatever surface it was and ended up stretching wider, and which made me think that my stitch gauge was all off. So usually what I'm trying to do when I'm blocking the back of a sweater mid-project is to make sure that my row gauge is accurate, and that if I need something to be, in this case, this sweater has to be 13 inches or 13 and a half, I don't remember which, at the point where you bind off, I want to make sure that when it's washed, it actually is 13 inches, that isn't longer than that or shorter than that, that my row gauge is accurate at this point, so that I can make that adjustment if I need to. But it also gives you a sense of comfort, I think, to see how nice the fabric looks and feels after it's been washed, because here's what it looks like, for me anyway, when it's on the needles. It's a bit more crumpled, the fabric is stiffer, so it wants to roll toward the knit side at the edge here. It wants to just roll over the top. It would do that at a bind off edge as well. And on the sides, it wants to roll toward the purl. That's just the way that stockinette behaves. But once it's been washed, it doesn't roll as much. The fabric relaxes. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's getting bigger. Sometimes it does, depending on your particular situation. But it will relax. And so that means that this is rolling a little bit at the edge, but it's not rolling like this. So it just gives me comfort to know that this is not what my fabric is going to look like. So if you are doing a swatch and you are trying different needles with your until you get the fabric that you like, but you're not washing the swatch, the fabric that you are going to get in your sweater, once you actually do wash it, is not going to be the same. So this is a little stiffer. So you might be thinking, oh, I like whatever the qualities are of this particular fabric, I'm going to go a little bit looser on the needle size than what the ball band says, for example, because I like that drape better. The problem is it's going to get more drape when it washes. So you do a swatch and you wash it before you knit your project to make sure that you like the fabric that you are going to get. So because this is rolling up, it's really hard to see what this sweater is supposed to be doing. What happened was I cast on, and then I started doing an increase at one edge, but you just can't see what I'm doing at this point. And when I got to here, I started knitting straight. So let me show you what this is actually going to look like. So the front part that I'm knitting right now, I cast on for all of the ribbing, including for the button band. And I knit those on a smaller needle until I got up to this point right here. And at that point, I put the button band, the buttonhole band stitches on stitch markers. This is what I had. Normally I would use waist yarn, but I didn't feel like getting up off my butt and going to get some. So I just put those on hold, and then I switched to the larger needle, and I'm working this part in stockinette. So after a few rows, then you start working an increase every inch, and then you work straight up here. And then what happens on the front is you bind off a few stitches here, like 4 stitches, and then you begin binding off all of the stockinette, or not binding off, you begin decreasing the stitches that are on the rest of the front here. You're working some decreases for the underarm for a while, and then you go straight. These are very similar to raglan decreases for a while, every right side row. But here, the decrease rate is different because you need to eliminate all of the stitches between here and here, or at least get down to just a couple stitches. And so the rate of decrease in order to get from here to here is 4 decreases every 6 rows. So it's a weird decrease. You're decreasing 2 rows, and then you skip a row of decreases, 2 rows, skip a row. So every 4 rows or every 6 rows, you're doing 4 decreases. And that creates this angle right here. So then what's going to happen is I'll come back down here to where these stitches are waiting. I'll put these back on the tinier needles, and I will work the rest of the button band all the way up here on the smaller needles. That won't be connected at this point. Everything's connected here, but it won't be connected right here. And then when I get up to this point where that decrease line is, I'm going to start increasing. I'm going to be increasing at the same rate that I decreased over here. So every 4 rows, there's going to be, or every 6 rows, there's going to be 4 increases over time. So I'm matching stitch for stitch, row for row on here, even though they're smaller needles and it's worked in ribbing. And what's that's going to do is it's going to need to stretch. It's not going to be floppy at all. It's going to have to stretch a bit to get up to the shoulder. And because it's ribbing, it's going to pull in a bit, so it's going to help create an actual V of this neckline right here. So this is a really interesting construction that I've never seen before. So before I start doing these decreases up here, right now I'm very close to where the underarm decreases are, so I'm very close to having to start the shaping. I'm going to be doing some swatches. I'm going to do 2 things. One is I'm going to do a swatch where I'm actually doing the decreases like the pattern says, but instead of going back and forth and increasing and then having to seam those 2 edges together, I am going to see if I can just pick up the stitches I need all the way along here, rib my way back, and then do short rows so that I'm working gradually longer and longer short rows along here. I don't know how well I will be able to do that because I won't be doing the decrease 2 rows in a row and then skip a decrease row. It would have to be pair of short rows. Yeah, I just don't know. I'm just not sure how to do the shaping using short rows. I have to do some experimenting. I have this idea of doing short rows where I can leave live stitches here and then just use those live stitches for when I'm working the ribbing. But I just don't know if it's going to work or not, which is why I need to do some swatching. And I will update you on that as I get that figured out. The sleeve has similar shaping at the beginning. This part is exactly like it is on this part of the armhole. And where it goes straight right here is where you see this part of the cap formed here. So because I'm concerned about the amount of yarn that I have and whether or not it's going to be enough to make full sleeves, I have 2 options. One is to make the entire sleeve top down by casting on instead of binding off at the end. I'm going to cast on, and then I could increase along here, cast on here instead of binding off, and then working decreases on my way down the sleeve. I could do that, or I could do what's called a provisional cast on, where I do like a temporary cast on right here where it's straight, work straight, bind off, and work the cap in this direction, come back to that provisional cast on, and then work the sleeve down. And the reason I might do that is maybe it sounds more complicated than just working the whole thing down, is because this line of decreases matches up with this line of decreases. They have the decreases placed in a very specific place so that along that seam line, they're running in parallel. And increases do not look like decreases upside down. They just look different. There is an increase that looks very similar to an upside down decrease, and that's called a lifted increase. So again, I'm going to be doing some swatching. I'm going to see whether I prefer doing both the sleeve cap and the underarm knit in the same direction, both using decreases, if I prefer that look, or if I find it acceptable to have the cap knit in the other direction, and if the increases on this edge are compatible with the decreases on this one, like if I like the look of it. So there's always options in knitting. There's always multiple ways of getting to the same endpoint. So I'm just looking at what could work in this situation based on the fact that I'm concerned about how much yarn I have and whether it's enough to create a full-length sleeve. But I should know by the time I get to this point of the sweater, I could work each of the 2 sleeve caps. You know, I could have the remaining yarn divided up, and I could kind of monitor. I'll know by then how many stitches I get per gram, and I'll know how many stitches are in the sleeve, and I'll be able to predict where it is I'm going to need to end the sleeve and start the ribbing. If I need a 3/4 length sleeve, though, I'm going to need I might need a different decrease rate. I'm going to have to check the instructions. The pattern does include instructions for 3/4 length sleeve and full length, and I'm not sure how the decrease rates or increase rates differ in the 2 versions. I'll have to take a look. Just a reminder that on Saturday, May 1st at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, I will be doing a live stream Q&A on short rows. So I've been telling you guys about this for a couple of weeks. I've gotten a lot of questions in my YouTube comments that people are wondering about and want to see answered. So I will be answering as many of those questions as I can, as well, hopefully, as being able to answer some of the questions in the live stream. So again, that's Saturday, May 1st at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. If you live in Australia or New Zealand, that is going to be Sunday, May 2nd, early in the morning. So if you are in the UK, it'll be about 10 p.m. at night. If you are in Central European time, it's going to be 11 o'clock at night, but it will be recorded. So if you can't see it live, you will be able to watch it at a later time whenever you are actually awake. So I hope to see you on the live stream. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.